So today's webinar is Using NSP for Supportive Housing Development. This webinar will review opportunities for utilizing NSP funding for the creation of permanent supportive housing. The presenters will provide the context for NSP as a viable tool to address both community revitalization and homeless response efforts. We'll briefly review some of the key elements of supportive housing and hear from NSP grantees that have leveraged the program for these purposes. Today's webinar is intended for NSP grantees, sub-recipients, developers, as well as Continuum of Care and other homelessness stakeholders. We have a lot of people with us today in the panelist side, and I'll get to them in a moment. Again, so what we'll be looking at are review of the basic neighborhood stabilization program and permanent supportive housing, those basics, understanding federal homelessness response, discussing various incentives for creating permanent supportive housing with NSP, and again, a couple of case studies, one from Oregon, one from Southern California, and Q&A for all of your questions. So with us today, we've got Mark Toussaint from Enterprise Community Partners, Anna Leva from HUD SNAP's office, Kimberly Black-King from the Corporation for Supportive Housing, Roberto Franco from the Oregon Housing and Community Services, Doug Swager and Mark Trotz are from Los Angeles, and then, of course, our regular NSP HUD folks, Hunter Kurtz, John Laswick, and David Noguera are joining us today. So welcome to all of you, and without further ado, let me turn the ball over to Mark Toussaint. Hi, Mark.
Hi, Kent, and thanks, everyone. Really delighted to be here. I'm Mark Toussaint with Enterprise Community Partners in the Southern California office, and I'm going to walk through for the next 15 or 20 minutes here a little bit about kind of the overview of NSP. But let me just start first with the agenda. It's a kind of a crowded agenda. I'm going to have to, unfortunately, move somewhat quickly through the material, but just wanted to kind of give you a sense of how the day is going to flow. So we had to make some tough decisions today about how we were going to sort of structure the agenda. What we're going to do is sort of start with an overview of NSP, then kind of go into a little bit about, step back and talk a little bit about the federal response to homelessness, then go to some basics about permanent supportive housing, and then probably what's most exciting is at the end we're going to hear from two communities, two grantees, State of Oregon and the City of Los Angeles, that have decided to invest NSP resources into advancing the creation of permanent supportive housing, and there are some other examples that we can point you to at the end of the presentation. Definitely want to acknowledge that we know there's a range of audiences out there today. We're bridging two kind of key topics, NSP and supportive housing, realizing that some of you are likely experts on homelessness or perhaps involved in the continuum of care, while others may be more active with NSP, may even be grantees, and maybe not as deep on supportive housing or homelessness. So we hope you find the material informative and not overly, redundant based on your experience level. So how we got to this webinar was really I think the understanding that there's communities struggling with both issues, that is high rates of homelessness and foreclosures. This is sort of a nexus that, and at least in our opinion, we felt like we had some room to address more distinctly. And so what we're trying to do today is package some information that we thought was salient for you all as to how the program can really be used to sort of as a tool in addressing homelessness and specifically the creation of permanent supportive housing. So we're going to spotlight some of those incentives, some of the considerations that the program offers, and like I said earlier, really just try to spotlight some good examples around the country where people are doing this. And when we say permanent supportive housing, and this is going to come up later with Kimberly's presentation, we're really talking about permanent affordable housing for homeless persons with special needs or disabilities. And we'll talk about why this model is particularly well suited for serving those that are most vulnerable in the homeless population. At the same time, we understand there's a lot of resources out there individually on supportive housing and or NSP, and we're not trying to recreate the wheel, but we will try to direct you to some more information on those respective areas. So just for the NSP program, for instance, there's so much information on the NSP Resource Exchange. That's at hudnsphelp.info. We have some resource links at the end of the presentation to direct you some of those resources, so please encourage you to look at those. And then a final note on the background. We understand the timeliness of this topic may be of interest to you. In other words, great information, great topic, but why now? And I just want to recognize that we understand the program's well underway with implementation. But for those of you that are in the grantee sort of audience, the NSP grantee audience, understanding that you may have some funding available that's not programmed, or you're receiving program income, this could be a valuable strategy to consider. And also just beyond NSP, I think we want to make the point that we understand there's going to be distressed properties in communities for some time, and certainly if you have the dual impact of homelessness in your community, this is going to be an ongoing need for you. So there's a lot, I think, that can be learned just that transcends the individual NSP program, but we are going to try to focus as much as we can on that program. So we want to just contextualize permanent supportive housing within the broader sort of efforts communities are engaging in terms of stabilizing communities. There's a lot of options available to communities in terms of advancing home ownership, pursuing rental housing, redeveloping properties, even demolishing properties. So where we feel like this is a good fit is where you're really trying to reestablish a healthy rental market and understanding that permanent supportive housing sort of fits in within that rental housing strategy. There's certainly some considerations to share around why this is important. So why pursue permanent supportive housing with NSP? Well, one, we just mentioned that it's certainly a key component of a broader revitalization strategy. We know communities are facing both homelessness and foreclosures at alarming rates. To consider this as sort of a viable component within that, and certainly where there's a lower demand for home ownership, this is a good fit. There's also, within the NSP program, some clear programmatic and statutory requirements that create some opportunities for permanent supportive housing. Beyond the program, there's broader policy advantages that can be realized as you look to leverage NSP for permanent supportive housing, and we'll get into those a little bit. And then finally, since this program was largely patterned after CDBG, which is really a key leveraging tool for communities, there's really a lot of opportunities for partnerships and leveraging to realize broader programmatic and policy objectives around homelessness and or community revitalization initiatives. So then a little bit about NSP, and we'll get into a little bit about what it does. So, dating back to 2008, there's been 3 rounds of NSP funding, totaling about $7 billion. And you'll often hear this referred to as NSP 1, NSP 2, and NSP 3. And while there are probably more similarities than differences between the 3 rounds in terms of what you can do with those funds, there are some distinctions. We won't really have time to get into a lot of those distinctions, but for the purposes of today, we'll try to talk about things that are relatively universal to all 3 rounds. For the most part, these funds were available via formula to states and localities, with the distinction that NSP 2 was a competitive program where even beyond units of government, nonprofits could also apply. And I think we get this question all the time is for those that are maybe more involved with homeless programs and maybe not connected to NSP, we get that question around how do we access the program and how do we make that connection. So I just want to point you to the NSP Resource Exchange, again, because it has a grantee search feature where you can really look at which communities received allocations and you can identify specific program contacts within that search feature. So then a little bit about the specifics of NSP, and we're just going to have time to hit some of the key ones. And I think this is something that, again, if you're familiar with the program, this will be pretty basic. But for those that aren't, it should be just a helpful reminder of some of the key considerations. First one is the target area, which is essentially saying that NSP grantees may only use funds in designated geographic areas that are most severely affected by foreclosures. And this is something that's defined at the application stage, and it's very important. In terms of eligible uses and eligible participants, there are specific restrictions on that. We'll get into those in an upcoming slide. In terms of the properties that are eligible, there's really 3 categories. There's foreclosed, abandoned, or vacant. We're going to have a separate slide on that as well. The LH25 requirement is really, really important. We're going to discuss that separately as well. It stands for the low-income housing requirement. Essentially means that 25% of the program funds for NSP must be used to assist individuals or households at or below 50% AMI, area median income, as defined by HUD. This is what we consider to be kind of one of the more important carrots offered by the program to do some deeper targeting for homeless households. The purchase discount is important because when grantees acquire foreclosed properties, it must be done at a minimum discount of 1% of the appraised value. Regarding tenant protections, just wanted to make a note that Congress and HUD have been very clear that they want to protect bona fide renters in foreclosed properties. So there are specific guidelines around how grantees are to treat properties in which there are tenants in place and bona fide tenants, including protections specifically for tenants who are receiving Section 8 assistance. And then finally, regarding timeliness, because these were emergency funds to really address a pressing foreclosure crisis around the country, there are very tight timelines on when funds need to be expended. NSP 1, for instance, requires that funds be expended within 4 years. NSP 2 and NSP 3 had deadlines around 50% of those funds needed to be spent within 2 years and all of the funds within 3 years. So that you can understand there's very tight timelines, and it's partly why I think HUD's been very active in trying to issue guidance around how the program is as it's rolled out, guidance on the program and meeting those requirements. There are 5 eligible uses for NSP. They're sort of used somewhat alphabetically, so just to review those real quickly. Use A allows for the establishment of financing mechanisms for the purchase and redevelopment of foreclosed homes and residential properties. Use B allows for the purchase and rehab of homes and residential properties that have been abandoned or foreclosed upon in order to sell, rent, or redevelop such homes or properties. Use C allows for the establishment and operation of land banks for homes and residential properties that have been foreclosed upon. Use D allows for demolishment of blighted structures. And finally, Use C allows for the redevelopment of demolished or vacant properties as housing. Just to note, under Use C, for instance, NSP 1 funds are allowed for non-residential purposes. So, for instance, if you wanted to convert a duplex into a community center, that would be allowable under NSP 1. NSP 2 and NSP 3, however, you can only do redevelopment to create housing. And when we say housing, we're talking about permanent housing. So, by way of some more examples, under Use B, a residential property that meets HUD's definition of foreclosure or abandonment could be acquired and rehabbed for use as permanent supportive housing. Under Use C, you could take a vacant or demolished property and redevelop that into permanent supportive housing. What we need to note, though, is that NSP funds cannot be used for social services, supportive services rather, or ongoing operations costs. So really the best use for permanent supportive housing, and this is what we found around the country, is as a capital source, primarily for acquisition and rehab. HUD has, and really, in essence, there's restrictions on who's eligible, and this is typical of a lot of federal programs, all federal programs. So in the case of NSP, it's limited to individuals and families whose income does not exceed 120% of area median income. And just for those that are familiar with CDBG, this is a little higher. So in essence, there's been sort of a new strata of income eligibility created, and what we're calling that is low, moderate, and middle income households. So LMMH is a common acronym you'll hear in the program. Now, this doesn't mean that you can't create mixed income developments where some of the units may be targeted to, folks that are not NSP eligible, but HUD has specific guidance on how that gets treated under NSP, and we can't get into that right now, but that is an important distinction. In terms of the properties that are eligible, like I said earlier, and this was even sort of reviewed a little bit in just the eligible uses, there are 3 definitions or 3 categories: foreclosed, abandoned, and vacant. I'm not going to go through defining each of these, but I just want to point to a policy alert that HUD issued back in 2010, April 2010, specifically on issuing guidance on these definitions. And I'd encourage you to look at that for specific language around these definitions. These definitions are important because they affect the eligibility of certain uses and activities in the program. In some cases, properties may qualify under both. And in that case, like for instance, if it qualifies as abandoned or foreclosed, HUD's asking you to sort of use the most restrictive category. These categories are also important because these properties must be located in the grantee's target area to be eligible for assistance. The LH25 requirement, as I mentioned earlier, is an important consideration in the creation of permanent supportive housing through NSP. And Congress put this into the legislation as a requirement that we now call LH25. It's essentially a requirement that 25% of your NSP grant amount, this is the original allocation plus available program income, must be used to create housing for individuals or households earning no more than 50% of AMI. This housing must be permanent housing to qualify, so individual leases, no limit on time, and specifically, there were some changes made recently, this is back in 2010, to allow for vacant properties to qualify as meeting this requirement. This is a funds test, primarily, but it's also going to be tied to occupancy. This is without question one of the greatest incentives that the program offers. to really do some deeper targeting. It's not that Congress or HUD is saying, look, you have to do permanent supportive housing with your LH25 requirement, but what we're saying is that it's a good opportunity to sort of advance some other community goals around homelessness. This income targeting also fits nicely with other federal capital financing programs, such as the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit and the Federal Home Program. There's been a significant amount of guidance HUD's issued on this specific requirement, including a webinar that was offered on May 20th of last month. So I'd encourage you to go to the NSP Resource Exchange if you're interested in more information about this requirement. We just list two examples, Knoxville, Tennessee, and Phoenix, Arizona, as two communities that have decided specifically to do permanent supportive housing with their LH25 requirement. Moving on to policy incentives, because certainly there are a lot of policy considerations in trying to tackle homelessness with NSP. To be very frank, this is a very rare opportunity with NSP for one-time federal funding to supplement and address unmet housing needs that you have in your communities, specifically housing for homeless and special needs populations. So in addition to fulfilling a core civic goal around revitalizing neighborhoods, there are a few key policy priorities that can be addressed in using NSP for permanent supportive housing. As we've mentioned, for starters, it will inevitably assist in meeting your LH25 requirement. Beyond that, this is a wonderful chance to align your local NSP implementation with local and national planning efforts, including strategies to end homelessness and specifically chronic homelessness. Just wanted to point out an example, the annual Continuum of Care NOFA, for those of you that are familiar with that, asks applicants to identify how they're coordinating with their local NSP program and other federal resources. So there's actually some sort of financial incentive around demonstrating that coordination. And more broadly than that, as you know, a lot of communities around the country are adopting or implementing 10-year plans to end homelessness. Nearly every plan calls for better resource coordination and increased bed capacity for PSH. Where we found good examples of NSP being used as PSH, it was because the grantees saw this as an advancement in fulfilling goals in their plan. The state of Oregon, for instance, and you'll hear from them later, is an example of that. Third, it's just good public policy. It's going to help reduce pressures on other systems of care that are likely serving chronically homeless folks, including ERs, emergency rooms, jails, other emergency facilities. And finally, there's a range, if you're fortunate enough at least to have a range of viable nonprofit housing operators in your community that have experience working with homeless populations and could be good stewards of this kind of housing and may even have experience with scattered site housing as a particular model. So it's important to capitalize on that kind of an asset. This slide just indicates a few of the resources that we've seen that communities are leveraging with NSP. And I won't get into each, but I just want you to kind of give a flavor for some of those programs that exist. These should for the most part, be recognizable. The LIHTC acronyms, again, stands for Low-Income Housing Tax Credit. MHSA is actually a California-specific program, stands for the Mental Health Services Act. It's a program in which allows for capital costs for housing that serves persons with mental illness. We understand that's not available throughout the country, but just to note that when we were talking with some of the California grantees, that was a common leveraging source. What we don't have on here are specific services subsidies. Just for the sake of time, I think that was a little long to list, but we do have examples of those at the end that we'll share. And certainly, I think as you hear from some of our guests, community examples, they'll get into a little bit about how that specific need was addressed. I definitely don't want to overlook that issue. I think by nature, and I'm sure Kimberly will explain this, creating and maintaining permanent supportive housing is by nature a collaborative endeavor. You simply can't address all the housing and supportive service needs alone, and nor should you. So in deciding to use NSP funds for permanent supportive housing, there's really a number of opportunities for public and private partnerships. We've listed some of those partners above. Again, not an exclusive list, but it does give you a flavor for the partners that provide for different types of support that you'll need. So capital financing, operations funding, social service funding, and agencies that can help you connect directly with housing providers, social service providers, and homeless clients themselves. And at one point I really want to make is that we really encourage Continuums of Care out there, if you're not doing so already, to really coordinate with your NSP lead agency so that you can try to work together or explore how you can mutually benefit one another to maximize housing options for the most vulnerable in your communities. On a final note, I just want to address a little bit of this issue of the types of housing that are appropriate for permanent supportive housing, because as you know, in communities there's lots of different options, there's different types of properties, and so what we've put here on this slide is just an example of some of the questions you should consider in deciding what is the best fit for the housing stock that you have in your community. Is there a high or low demand for home ownership? Are there nonprofits that are already experienced doing scattered site housing? How are you going to address potential community opposition or resistance to permanent supportive housing in that neighborhood? And how are properties going to be located in some proximity to services and other amenities that they're going to need to be able to remain housed? Those are all important questions to consider. For the sake of this discussion, there's really three categories that we want to just include for permanent supportive housing types. The first one, and I think this is typically what people think about when they think about foreclosures, is single-family homes. So again, we understand that this stock is a good fit for families. It gives a sense of privacy, a sense of choice and pride. It's also a good disposition strategy where there's limited demand for home ownership. And it can be used as a shared housing model for veterans, transition-age youth, and adults with developmental disabilities. Second category are small properties or small multifamily properties, really 2 to 4 units. Typically, those are less attractive to home buyers and more often than not used as rental income properties. Again, it does provide opportunities for sharing of housing or for renting to small families as well. And then finally, multifamily housing is really what I think folks feel more familiar with when they think of permanent supportive housing. It certainly is an opportunity for NSP grantees to spend funds in a little bit more quicker and efficient way. But it's also an opportunity to do mixed income projects where you have a portion of the units that are dedicated to supportive housing or special needs tenants. And it also leverages very well with some of these other sources we've mentioned, such as home, low-income housing tax credits, Section 8, Shelter Plus Care, and so on and so forth. And finally, just a note about a guide that Enterprise released earlier in the year on the topic of NSP and supportive housing. This was not something that was funded through the NSPTA program, but was funded through HUD's Section 4 capacity building program. It's a useful topic. It sort of digs a little deeper on some of the issues we're going to talk about today, raising awareness on the topic, talking about how NSP can tackle homelessness, and it also includes a lot of examples from around the country where communities are using NSP for permanent supportive housing. It's one of those things I would really encourage you to look at. We're also including it as a link at the end of the presentation, and it does get into some of the other issues we won't really have time to discuss today, such as design issues, as well as property management considerations. So that's it for me.
Thank you, Mark. Let's see, we've got, I'm not sure if you know the answer to this question offhand, but Tyler asks what the names of the low-income projects in Tennessee and Arizona are.
So I do have those. Just if you want to give me a sec to pull those up. I believe the Knoxville project was called Minvilla Manor, and that's a big multifamily project. For Phoenix, let's see, give me a second here. The Royal Suites Apartments. This was 80 units of PSH for formerly homeless men and women, with at least 8 units available for individuals with physical disabilities. It's using Continuum of Care funding as well as Section 8. Back to Knoxville, there was 2 projects. One was going to be redeveloping a vacant condemned hotel. This was the Minvilla Manor. And then a Flanagan project, which was redeveloping a vacant school site plagued by vandalism and water damage into 48 affordable apartments for chronically homeless individuals. This is something that grew out of their local 10-year plan.
Very good. Thanks for that question, Tyler. And it looks like we can move on to Anna Leva. And let me give her the presenter ball and make sure she can be heard. And there we go. Hi, Ann.
Hi. Good afternoon, everybody. Again, my name is Ann Oliva. I am the Director of the Office of Special Needs Assistance Programs here at HUD. And today I'm actually pinch hitting for Christy Greenwalt from the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit, provide you some context about USICH and the Federal Strategic Plan. So I'll start here. The U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, or USICH, is an independent agency within the federal branch that consists of 19 federal cabinet secretaries and agency heads. And this group is currently chaired by the Department of Health and Human Services Secretary Sebelius, and our current vice chair is VA Secretary Shinseki. And I'm going a little bit out of order, but the mission of the council is to coordinate the federal response to homelessness and create partnerships at every level of government and with the private sector to reduce and end homelessness across the country. And I think it's important today for you all to sort of understand why we're doing this joint webinar. And we really want to talk about how the NSP program used locally can help us reach our goals to prevent and end homelessness. And I want to talk a little bit about how it fits into the administration's goals on homelessness. So let's talk a little bit about the plan itself. So the council was charged by Congress with coordinating the federal response to homelessness, and in June 2010, the Obama administration announced the first ever comprehensive federal plan to end homelessness. And the plan is based on 52 strategies under 5 broad themes and focused on 4 goals. And the goals are up on the screen in front of you. The first is to finish the job of ending chronic homelessness by 2015, to prevent and end homelessness among veterans by 2015. So those are both 5-year goals. To prevent and end homelessness among families, youth, and children by 2020. So that's a 10-year goal. And to really set a path to ending all types of homelessness within the time frame of the plan. So again, I'm not going to talk about all 52 strategies. There's plenty of resources up on a couple of different websites that I'll mention throughout my presentation about those 52 strategies. But I want to sort of talk about those 5 broad themes. And the broad themes are up on your screen. Again, it's increasing leadership and collaboration, increasing access to stable and affordable housing, increasing economic security, improving health and stability, and really taking a critical look at the homeless crisis response system and retooling that system. So Opening Doors, the Federal Strategic Plan, really serves as a roadmap for joint action by the 19 council member agencies, along with our state and local partners across both the public and private sectors. And all of you know who are watching here today that there is really no one-size-fits-all plan. Every community has a unique set of strengths and challenges, different types of constraints locally. So while Opening Doors really lays out a set of strategies that guide our collective efforts, the Council has called upon communities across the country to develop your local plans that align with the federal goals, but that really acknowledge and work with the unique circumstances and opportunities in each community. And really the strategies in the plan are built on the conclusion that mainstream housing, health, and human service programs must be fully engaged and coordinated to prevent and end homelessness. I think you heard from Mark a little earlier that we really are looking at, the McKinney money for homelessness and the HUD-VASH program. Those are all important resources, but they're not the only resources to be used towards the plan and towards preventing and ending homelessness. And in fact, we know we can't end homelessness with just those resources. So that's why everybody on this call is such an important player in our national effort to end homelessness, because there is such huge strength in collaboration. If you're on the call and you're not familiar with who is in charge of your local plan, either your 10-year plan or your Continuum of Care plan, I would encourage you to start with your local Continuum of Care, and you can get contact information for your local Continuum of Care on the Homelessness Resource Exchange, which is sort of the sister site to the NSP Resource Exchange. It's located at www.hudhre.info. And if you go on the header toolbar under COC grantee information, that's where you can find local contact information. So while the plan overall is about the work of all of the federal agencies, of course, HUD's primary emphasis with regard to the plan and its implementation is really about the creation of housing opportunities. And the plan contains two specific objectives with regards to housing. One is the creation of more affordable housing opportunities for people who are homeless or at most risk of homelessness, and the creation of more permanent supportive housing. Obviously, affordable housing is an appropriate intervention for many people who are homeless or at risk of homelessness who have lower barriers to housing. But today, what we're talking about really is permanent supportive housing, which combines rental subsidy with intensive wraparound services. It's a proven solution for individuals with higher barriers that need intensive services to obtain and maintain their housing. And these are often individuals and families that have been homeless for long periods of time. They have severe physical or mental health issues, and they're often frequent users, as Mark mentioned, of other costly public systems like emergency rooms, emergency shelters, hospitals, and jails. A growing body of evidence confirms that communities can experience significant cost savings by housing these highly vulnerable individuals. The plan itself is based on, or the goals and timeframes are really based on an analysis of both the need and the interventions. That is, what is the need across the country, and what are the best types of ways to serve people who have specific barriers, and how many of each types of those kinds of housing that you have up on the screen in front of you do we need nationally. I think this is especially relevant in this difficult fiscal environment because our ability to target interventions according to need is going to be critical to our success. And the analysis that we've done, both by HUD and the USICH, really drives both policy decisions and resource discussions. I also want to note that because homelessness is not distributed evenly across the country, each community should be doing a similar analysis as part of their local planning process. HUD is planning to publish a tool to help folks have these critical discussions locally, so hopefully we'll be able to follow up with some instructions around that tool in the next couple of months. I'm going to leave you with some additional context for this discussion, especially for those of you who are newer to this conversation. And as I mentioned earlier, first, while our targeted resources, such as Continuum of Care programs and HUD-VASH, are certainly an important part of the solution, we are not likely to see big increases in federal funding to these program budgets in the coming years. So as such, our success at meeting the goals of the federal plan will increasingly depend on our ability to tap into mainstream housing and service resources to assist the most vulnerable members of our communities. And with permanent supportive housing in particular, both the Council and HUD are really encouraging our communities to think about how to manage access to units that are set aside for homeless individuals and families through a coordinated or centralized process that prioritizes the most vulnerable individuals and families for placements into units. So hopefully all of that provided you with some context, the context that you need to understand the federal effort. And I think with that, I'm going to turn it back to Kent so he can move the ball to the next person.
Thank you very much, Anne. And could you just repeat that web address you gave just a couple slides ago?
Of course. It's the Homelessness Resource Exchange, and it's located at www.hudhre.info.
Terrific. Thank you very much. And thanks for that good information. And we will now move to Kimberly Black-King. Hi, Kimberly.
Hello. Thank you. So I'm Kimberly Black-King, and I am the Mid-Atlantic Director for the Corporation for Supportive Housing, and I am going to go over a few of the basics for permanent supportive housing. So both Anne and Mark touched on the definition for permanent supportive housing, being defined as safe, affordable, permanent rental housing combined with a range of flexible supportive services that are designed for people with special needs. So again, the premise behind the supportive housing model is based on services being provided either on-site or within close proximity to the housing site that will help people transition out of homelessness, remain housed, and live in communities as independently as possible. So there are two core components to permanent supportive housing. One is the housing, and the other core piece is the services. The housing must be permanent, so there's no time restrictions for how long a person or a family can stay in permanent supportive housing. The housing must also be affordable, which in general means that a person is not paying or a family is not paying more than 30% of their gross income towards their rent and utility cost. And lastly, the housing must be independent of services. So the housing is not conditioned on the tenant's treatment. People in permanent supportive also, I should mention that they also have a lease, and the leases are consistent with standard rental leases that defines the tenant protections as well as many responsibilities of the tenant. With respect to the services should be flexible and ongoing, meaning that they are actually designed appropriately to meet the tenant's needs, and they're available for when the tenant should need them. The services are also voluntary and independent of housing. Again, the independence of housing piece. So tenants are generally not required to participate in services as a condition of remaining in housing. And the philosophy behind that voluntary and independent service piece really goes back to housing being a basic right. So therefore, formerly homeless people shouldn't be required to meet conditions for housing that wouldn't be imposed on people who don't have histories of homelessness or disabilities. So who's PSH for? HUD defines those eligible for PSH as an individual or family that has been homeless and has a qualifying disability. And a qualifying disability, is noted here on the slide, is expected to be long continuing or of an indefinite duration, is substantially impedes a person's ability to live independently. The condition could be improved by the provision of more suitable housing conditions, and the disability is a physical, mental, or emotional impairment, including impairment caused by alcohol and or drug abuse, post-traumatic stress disorder, and brain injury. Developmental disability and HIV/AIDS are also considered a qualifying disability. So Mark touched on a couple of the different types of permanent supportive housing, but actually before I go to this slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the demographics of this population that permanent supportive housing is for. So homelessness has often been viewed as a one-dimensional issue, and it's assumed that homeless people, especially the chronically homeless individuals, are social misfits who either don't want to work or can't work and achieve stability in the community. But we know differently, and chronically homelessness, that population is really not one-dimensional at all. A large number of the homeless men and some women are veterans. This number is around 13%. A significant number of the PSH population, we estimate this to be more than half based on different surveys and samples of those in permanent supportive housing, to be suffering from a mental illness, a severe mental illness, and or drug and alcohol addiction. For individuals, those who are not accompanied by other family members, the population tends to be dominated by males. And we also have recent research that we were provided by USICH that shows that in 1990, the cohort for this group had a mean age of 30. In 2000, the mean age was 40, and today the mean age is 50. So increasingly aging population. It also shows that adults who are chronically homeless have a life expectancy of 62 years. For families, the adult or the family head of household is overwhelmingly female with an average age of 31, and over half of the children in these families are under the age of 6. Okay, so moving to the types of permanent supportive housing, which Mark touched on a little bit. I should say that similar to affordable housing, permanent supportive housing should always be designed to be consistent with existing housing stock in the surrounding neighborhood when you're planning your development. And there are three basic types. The single site, which is where all of the apartment units or the buildings in a complex or the single-family homes are exclusively designated for permanent supportive housing. The scattered site model, where several units of existing rental housing are leased and therefore scattered throughout the community. And the integrated model, which was also touched on earlier, where a defined number of permanent supportive housing units are set aside within a larger development. And this integrated model is a very good and savvy financial strategy, because the higher incomes from the non-permanent supportive housing units actually help subsidize the permanent supportive housing units. So again, a really great opportunity exists when matching your 25% set aside for people at or below 50% of AMI when participating in NSP. So there are various ways, mechanisms to create permanent supportive housing, and you're probably all familiar with these, so just quickly, they include a rehab, which goes really well with NSP, the NSP program. New construction is obviously another tool. Master leasing, where there's a group of apartments that are rented by one master sponsor and then sublet to PSH tenants. Turnkey developments, where the developer doing the construction or rehab doesn't have an ongoing investment in the property, but instead turns it over to the project sponsor. This actually helps with project capacity building as well. So if there are nonprofits who have generally provided transitional housing or just services and they're interested in permanent supportive housing, pairing with a developer who has that experience can really help the capacity of that agency if they're interested in moving towards permanent supportive housing. There's also scattered site, which is property in the existing market being rented or purchased by a sponsor and rented directly to permanent supportive tenants. That could also be master leasing. And set-asides, as mentioned on the previous slide with integration, this is where there are permanent supportive housing set aside in the larger developments. So essential to permanent supportive housing, as with any other housing, is definitely the financing. And the financing can be thought of as the three-legged stool. We often refer to it as the three-legged stool, where there is the three legs, one being capital, which are the costs associated with housing development, the operating cost, which includes the rental assistance, and the supportive service costs. So clearly, with supportive housing, the uniqueness here is that if you take any of these legs away, the project doesn't work. So you have to have all three to make your project work. Other than that, the housing development activities for PSH are the same as any other housing development. The only difference is the need for really soft financing, very low interest rate loans, and participation in programs like NSP, since the rental income from the permanent supportive housing units typically can't cover significant debt service that you would have with mainstream affordable housing. So with permanent supportive housing, there's typically a deficit between the cost of operating a housing development and the rents from PSH tenants. Again, this goes back to the savvy strategy of the integration model, because you have other units at market rate or affordable rates that can help subsidize those units. Otherwise, that deficit is typically bridged by rental and or operating subsidies. So other essential features associated with permanent supportive housing includes assertive outreach and engagement, which is very important to linking the target populations to the right housing opportunities. And outreach is particularly important with the chronically homeless population, because other more traditional processes like just scheduling an appointment have proven to be less successful at initial recruitment stage. So when you're trying to get someone recruited into housing and services, to really reach that vulnerable population, and this is the population that really is best served by permanent supportive housing. The outreach really has to be done in the communities where the homeless people are, so on the streets, in shelters, drop-in centers, et cetera. And also continued outreach is very important, even once a person is housed, to help encourage residents to participate in housing so that they're able to maintain their remain stably housed. And of course, as with any housing, permanent supportive housing should be safe and decent housing. It's really important to think about the safety in PSH. As I mentioned earlier, a significant percentage of people living in PSH have had or are struggling with a substance abuse. So developers, property managers, and service providers really need to think through the safety issues of the property. Other essential features around services, the services should be accessible. So services can be located on-site, off-site, or a combination of both. The decision to provide services to tenants at the housing site or off-site really depends on the program scale, the resources of the program, the severity of the residents' needs, and the proximity to other off-site services. So I've mentioned some of these already, but some typical supportive services include counseling, health care and mental health services, alcohol and substance abuse treatment. The promotion of independent living skills is very important, money management and financial planning, employment services, and a host of other services that are really dictated by your tenant population. So who creates permanent supportive housing? You'll see on this slide many people. Both Ann and Mark talked about the numbers of people involved in permanent supportive housing and how important collaboration is. And I really have to just reiterate that. It's very important. If we go back to the financing slide and you just think solely about the financing with the capital, operating, and services, you can tell just from that slide that your partnership is going to be very wide. So in addition to the federal partners like HUD, multiple state departments and agencies operate programs that impact permanent supportive housing. The primary ones include Department of Housing and Community Development, Department of Mental Health, and Department of Health and Human Services. And nonprofits typically play a huge role in developing housing projects and providing supportive services. Most of these projects are developed in a partnership with a housing provider or housing developer and a service provider. The Public Housing Authority is also a key partner because they control the operating subsidy or most of the operating subsidies. Some jurisdictions also have local operating subsidy programs, but the Housing Authority, the Public Housing Authority, controls the federal programs. And private developers and private landlords are also key in creating permanent supportive housing. So I mentioned some of the typical partners as being Department of Housing, Community Development, Mental Health, and then there are other partners in permanent supportive housing that when you think of housing, you really don't think of them as your natural partners. So like the Department of Corrections, for example, but tons of people in this population cycle through street homelessness, shelter, Department of Corrections, jail, prisons, and so it's really important to partner with Department of Corrections, which really doesn't seem like, again, a natural marriage when you think of housing. But this slide I like particularly because it shows all of the vastness of the partnerships. And to reiterate, there are currently a lot of interagency efforts going on to end homelessness, chronic homelessness, at both the federal level, as discussed during this webinar with USICH, as well as at the state level and at your local level. So these efforts are all designed to better coordinate activities and help leverage the resources for the participating agencies, the providers, developers, and service providers. So a little bit on the development team. The development team looks very similar to that of any other affordable housing development team with the special addition of the supportive housing service provider. And I'll mention that it's important to have that person on board as soon as possible, because when you're thinking through your development plan, you want to think about your population. So the service provider can really provide a lot of insight to the type of units you'll need and the layout for the housing development. And in thinking through that team, some of these team members will have long-term interests, like your owner, the property manager, service provider, clearly neighbors, residents of the development, and funders. And then others will have short-term interests, like engineers, turnkey developers, or development consultants. And this is important to think about as you think through structuring how you should structure your relationships. And this last slide shows some of the typical roles of the long-term partners in permanent supportive housing. Some of these roles might actually be within the same organization, but the separation of duties and roles are clearly defined. So the first role being the property sponsor and owner, who represents the long-term interest of the building and is really the driving force behind the project. The second role is the developer, who provides the services necessary to acquire, construct, and to offer rehab for the property. And the third role being the property manager, who operates and maintains the property. Next, the supportive service provider that designs and implements the supportive services plan. And when you're thinking through your property manager and the service provider, it's very important to remember that there should be a separation between these two functions. So the property managers can focus on housing, and they're the experts for different concerns like collecting rent or building maintenance, while the service providers can focus on their expertise, which is around treatment planning and case management. So in other words, you don't want the same individual going to collect rent to be the person that goes to check on the person and do the treatment planning. So this helps avoid confusion with the tenants, among the tenants and other provider staff. And then last on this slide, but certainly not last in your consideration, is a very important role of engaging the tenants. This is huge. It really helps build some of the ownership of the tenants. And some ways to engage tenants includes having them involved in designing and implementing their own service plans. And they also serve really well on housing project committees, and which really helps inform designing programs or designing developments. So with that, I will end and turn it back over to Kent for a few questions before we go into specific examples.
Great. Thank you, Kimberly. All that information about permanent supportive housing. And we do have a couple of questions. Let's see if how this goes from Kevin. Can NSP multifamily properties be used as a transition for homeless to permanent housing?
Should I kick that over to the NSP
Perhaps
expert?
we should. Let me get to.
You're muted now.
There we go. There's Hunter.
Yes, we're here.
Hi. Yeah. There are some limits to what you can do with non-permanent housing in NSP, and basically only in NSP 1 could you do something like that, but it's quite possible that you developed a property with NSP 1 funds. You could use it as a transitional center, but for the most part, NSP funds are supposed to be used for permanent housing of different types.
Very good. Thank you for that question, Kevin. And let's see, how about Mark asks, are there any new incentives for localities to use NSP for permanent supportive housing development?
So this is Anne from the SNAP's office. I would say from the homeless services perspective, the biggest incentive for our continuums of care to use these types of funds are not only obviously to meet the goals of their own plan and the national plan, but we incentivize the use of mainstream resources and other types of funding through the point system in our Continuum of Care application. So in other words, you would likely receive more points if you were using NSP funds and able to show that in your Continuum of Care application.
And I think from the NSP side, the incentive that I would see is just the sort of financial one that you could potentially tap into less expensive real estate and thereby lower your capital costs, or in addition to spreading some of the capital costs to the NSP program. So that would be my suggestion.
And let's take one more here from Daphne, who says, I'm a new housing counselor, 5 months, and one of the NSP properties they've got is very difficult to sell. Is it possible that the property can be used for permanent supportive housing, and what would that process be?
Definitely it's possible, and in fact we see a lot of communities right now struggling with inventory that isn't working out according to the original plan for any number of perfectly valid reasons. And so we have been encouraging communities to take a look at alternatives to the original plan. In some cases that might be going from an ownership to a rental, but in your case, if it makes sense from a location standpoint, in terms of the population that you're serving, if this is a good neighborhood to put them in, it would definitely be an appropriate transition.
So, Kent, this is Ann. Can we go back to the first question that was asked about transitional housing?
Sure.
Just to provide some clarification. If the person who asked that question is thinking about reallocating a project that was transitional housing and changing it into permanent supportive housing, from our perspective on the Continuum of Care side, if there are Continuum of Care funds in there, that is absolutely doable. However, I would just make sure that if there were hard costs involved in that project, from our side there is a 20-year use restriction that they would have to continue to abide by, although using it for permanent supportive housing would be compliant with the use restriction.
Great. Thank you. And let's now go to Roberto Franco and hear a little bit about what's going on with Oregon Housing and Community Services. And Roberto is the manager of the home ownership section there. And there we go. Hi, Roberto.
Hello, good afternoon. And I'm trying to click on my slide.
There you go.
All right, thank you.
Just got it.
All right. Again, this is Roberto Franco. I'm the manager in the homeownership section in our agency, the Oregon Housing and Community Services. We are the housing finance agency for the state, and it's in my section that the NSP program has been housed, and we've been delivering the program. Before I talk about or highlight some of the information on the slides, I just want to give a brief background how we got to, in this particular case, using NSP funds for permanent supportive housing. Back in our own biennium of 2007-2009, our agency made as a strategic priority and funding priority the creation of housing and permanent supportive housing for people experiencing homelessness. During those years, we had established our own state fund to truly create permanent supportive housing, and we did more than 200 units in a period of 3 to 4 years because we used various techniques in creating the housing. We used in mixed tenancies. We funded in standalone properties. But coming 2010 into 2011, that state funding that we had established was running out, and we looked at NSP as the next funding stream that we could utilize in continuing with our initiative and our priority of, again, providing permanent housing for homeless persons. And we knew that creating housing and then especially doing new construction is a lot more expensive than doing acquisition and rehab. And using the NSP program gave us a lot of advantages using the abandoned and foreclosed properties and with the discounted prices. And we also knew that using the program and then applying the rules, that we could turn the units a lot faster than if we did new construction. In new construction, we would be faced with zoning and other issues that, again, it's typical in new construction. So doing acquisition and acquiring foreclosed properties and rehabbing them, we would skip a lot of those steps that normally are with new construction. Our agency is also the lead agency in the state for the implementation for the state 10-year plan. And it was in 2007-2009 that we saw a huge movement in our state from local communities in creating the local 10-year plans. So we clearly saw that there was a link as a state agency leading the state 10-year plan as the agency providing the funding for affordable housing, that it was a natural place for us to play a role in continuing with such initiative. So in 2010, we got NSP2 funding. Now, we had originally applied for a lot more money than we got. We had applied for close to about $23 million. So our proposal was for a much larger number of units, but we got less than $7 million in our total NSP2 funds. And we then had to reduce the size of the allocated funds from NSP that we could use for it. So in our case, the only NSP round that we've used for permanent supportive housing at this point has been NSP2 funding. So in 2011, we went out for a request for applications and targeting the communities that were eligible and that were part of our NSP2 consortia. In our case, there were 7 counties in the state that were eligible and were participant in the consortia of NSP2. So those were the communities where we were targeting. And we were asking developers, private nonprofit housing developers for affordable housing to send proposals and applications to us to create such housing in those targeted communities. And we based our RFA on previous experiences, again, since we go back to 2007. So we had the foundation of what we needed to see in a proposal. So we had criteria for acquisition and rehab, such for accessibility. We had standards established, what acquisition and rehab elements need to be included. We have standards, architectural standards and construction that would apply for new construction. We put all of those as part of the request for application so that the developers knew what is it that we wanted to see. Our goal had been for, again, 10 units. And we knew that would be expensive to create permanent supportive housing. I think in some of the earlier presenters talk about for the population that for these units, we know that they are zero income, very low income. To add a debt or a loan to the development or the acquisition and rehab of a project would definitely make it less affordable. So we had expected high acquisition costs, so we had only targeted 10 units. Our state, the majority of our state is rural in nature. We have very few metropolitan areas, and that were not part of the NSP2 consortium. And if they were, they had very small and a few neighborhoods that have eligible properties. So our developers that came in with a proposal were mostly from these 2 counties, the Deschutes County in the central Oregon area and Jackson County in the southern part of the state. And those were also the hardest hit counties, not only for the current recession, but all along too. They've always had a high rate of homelessness and chronic homelessness even before the recession. So for us, too, that made a perfect sense of targeting the resources for creating permanent supportive housing where the rate of homelessness was much higher. And we had applications from these three organizations, the Central Housing Authority, the Jackson County Housing Authority, and a nonprofit, the Central Oregon Veterans Outreach Office. For the housing authorities, it made perfect sense. Most of them work with us in the creation of affordable housing, and they too have access to resources that could provide leveraging for the permanent housing subsidy. And I'll talk a little bit more later about the resources that we use in providing for operations and services. We have limited resources, so we rely on some of these organizations' own resources so that there is a long-term availability of resources for the operations and the subsidies. And the Veterans Outreach Office, they do, as such, they have access to other federal resources targeting homeless veterans. When we started with our permanent supportive housing initiatives, we did rely heavily on the work and the publications and the research from the Corporation for Supportive Housing. And like in the previous slides from the permanent support, the Corporation for Supportive Housing, we also looked at, that was a three-legged stool, that there has to be permanent, there has to be funding for services, there has to be funding for operations. And we looked at the definition of homelessness. And when we started out, we thought that, this is back in 2007 or before, the definition of chronic homelessness was too restrictive for what we wanted to do and for what the state experienced. So our definition included a much broader characteristic of people experiencing homelessness, and because we wanted to make it work. And that would have included, individuals and single people experiencing homelessness, but included families as well. And we even made it broader to include victims of domestic violence that show that they have experienced homelessness or would face homelessness, or victims of domestic violence that have been transitioned in and out of temporary housing, shelter, or safe haven homes. Those, they would have qualified, and they have qualified for many of the units that we funded in the past. Just quickly so that the amount of funding that we have dedicated out of our NSP2 funds for permanent supportive housing, it's less than $1.3 million. But again, because NSP does not permit the use of funding for operations or other type of subsidies, so we brought in other state money into the mix. So basically, we came in with more than $2 million to make it work. And as we break it out there, we call it our General Housing Assistance Program. That's state funding. We put in that much money that could be used for capital, but most of our partners that develop the units use it for operating subsidies and services. And we have another state funding program of $1 million that's just strictly for acquisition and construction, and then NSP2 money. I went over this already. Again, we wanted to make sure that there was enough funding. It's costly to operate permanent supportive housing, and so we needed to have enough resources to make it work. These slides just briefly show the actual amount of funding that has come from the various sources available for this initiative, and the number of housing and the units that we've been able to produce. Now, as I mentioned earlier, our goal in our proposal to HUD for NSP had been for 10 units, but we've exceeded that quite a bit. And because, again, of targeting the foreclosed and abandoned properties and doing acquisition and rehab, our total cost per unit is actually about $75,000. The total cost that we have here, the 99, includes the cost that we've dedicated per unit for the operating subsidies and services. If you take that away, we're actually talking about less than $80,000 per unit. Unlike new construction, it would have cost us over $100,000 to do the units. So we're pleased that we've met our requirement for the 25%, but that wasn't the main reason that we targeted and created the initiative. It was really to create permanent supportive housing. But again, we're glad that it worked out better than we wanted. And so I'm going to stop there to take any questions.
So I think what we'll do now is to move straight on to Mark Trotz and Doug Swager to discuss their program in LA, and then we'll see what questions come in for either of these two case studies here. So
that works for me too.
Okay, let me get the ball over here to Doug. Hi, Doug.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Doug Swager with the City of Los Angeles Housing Department, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to talk about our NSP program and some of the aspects of it. I'm going to be tag teaming this presentation with Mark Trotz, who's representing Los Angeles County, and I'm going to start off by a little bit of background on foreclosures and NSP in Los Angeles, a little in our program, and then turn it over to Mark to talk about sort of the goals of the permanent supportive housing program, some of our partners, and I'm going to come back and talk about some of the properties, and then Mark's going to finish it up. So, yeah, in Los Angeles, we've had since 2007 over 65,000 foreclosures in the city, and as you look at the foreclosures, they're primarily single-family homes and a large number of 2 to 4 unit properties. And this, the permanent supportive housing initiative with NSP for us, I think is a good representative of how the NSP program has evolved since its beginning. When we first started NSP, we started with NSP 1, and we'd received a grant of $32 million. And our intent at that time was to acquire foreclosed single-family homes and rehab them and, resell them as affordable home ownership opportunities, as well as to acquire some of the 2 to 4 unit rental buildings and rehabilitate those and turn them over to other mission-driven organizations to operate as affordable rental housing. And we went through the process, partnering with Enterprise to create a nonprofit in the city, Restore Neighborhoods LA is what we call them. And they were going to be a sub-recipient of the city, and they were going to be the agency to acquire and do the rehabilitation and sell these properties. And then NSP 2 came along, and the city was awarded a grant of $100 million. And then NSP 3 came, and it was another $10 million. So as the program has grown and expanded, we've got into a lot of other initiatives and partnerships. So, for example, we're partnering with our housing authority on rehabbing some properties that they'll use as replacement housing and for some of the residents of the public housing projects. There's some of the properties that we've bought that are in such poor condition it makes more sense to reconstruct them, and we're trying to demonstrate a program to show sort of net zero energy homes with a few of those houses. We've partnered with our Rec and Parks Department. We've got 9 properties under our NSP1 program that will be used as community parks, primarily in South Los Angeles. And we've got into some adaptive reuse of properties, historic preservation. So as the program has evolved, it's a great story. I think the NSP story is going to be really good at the end when we see everything that everyone's done. And the Permanent Supportive Housing Initiative is one of those things that has sort of come into play during this evolution. And so some of the properties that we've acquired, it's primarily these 2 to 4 unit properties, but also some other multifamily buildings that we're using for this initiative. And before I go too far into those, I think I'm going to turn it over to Mark to talk about the goals and some of our other partners.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mark Trotz, and this is absolutely a great partnership that we have to talk about here. And as you may know, LA County is working very diligently to reduce and end homelessness. In LA, we probably have the largest homeless population in the country, and both from the city, community, county level, there's a real effort to ramp efforts up in the county. And the health department of the county, Department of Health Services, is wanting to really increase its effort in ending homelessness, particularly for chronically homeless people and people who've been revolving through the health system at very high cost to themselves, individually, and to the health system. And so in that effort to do that, we're going to be looking at all sorts of models and ways to get that done. I think many of us who've been working on ending homelessness for a long time recognize that to get to a scale that we need to be meaningful and to really get the goal, which is that all people have housing, you have to pursue a multi-pronged strategy. So this initiative that we've partnered up with the City of LA is sort of one of the first projects out of the gate of the county's health department's new collaborations to get this job done. And you can see on the screen the 3 simple goals that we have for this are to improve the health and well-being of vulnerable populations, particularly people dealing with chronic homelessness, high rates of disability, and chronic health conditions. Equally important, and the way we're fueling the funding for this is the achieving the goal of reducing the cost that chronic homeless people cause to the public health system. And there's a lot of data on that. It was alluded to earlier in the slide, and we're going to touch upon that at the end too. But that's one of the real drivers that we're relying on here. And in this particular instance, we're also going to be achieving restoring neighborhoods by working on these foreclosed properties that typically, when you go down the block of the properties that we're looking at, are generally the worst property on the block. So as has been discussed, to achieve the 3 prongs on the stool and the multiple parties you need to get this job done, we've got a great set of partners here, sort of all doing what they do best. We've got, the Los Angeles Housing Department, who Doug works for, making this extraordinary contribution of, I think, close to $12 million in rehab sites for this project. And then you've got the City of Los Angeles Housing Authority stepping up and providing the rental subsidies that make this possible. Restore Neighborhoods LA is the entity that Doug referenced in terms of the new nonprofit that was set up to acquire these properties and get them rehabbed. And then the county health agencies that are listed there coming in to fund and provide the support services. So all of us there, all 6 of us there, are making this happen.
Okay, Mark, I'll step back in.
Yes, please.
So from the NSP standpoint, I'd mentioned earlier that, we have, through our nonprofit RNLA, acquired a significant number of single-family homes and smaller 2 to 4 unit rental properties, and some larger rental properties, 6, 8, 12 units. And it was always our intent with those rental properties, one, to use those to meet the LH25 requirements of NSP. So those units would be turned over to other nonprofits to own and operate. as affordable rental housing for households with incomes below 50% of the area median. And so, another aspect of the properties that we're buying, and if you look at this slide, they're all blighted. So we took one of our values in the program here in LA was to acquire sort of what we term the worst of the worst properties. So we tried to identify the absolute worst, most dilapidated foreclosed properties, in these neighborhoods on these blocks, with the belief that if we can turn those properties around, rehab those properties, they're going to have the most significant or dramatic effect in those neighborhoods. And there's other NSP 2 grantees in the city that we're coordinating with, and they're buying properties in these same neighborhoods that are not in such poor condition. So between all of the NSP grantees in LA, we're affecting different levels of properties and having sort of a cumulative effect in the neighborhoods. And so 15 of the properties we had, through working with Mark, identified as those that would be, the most conducive for this program. And they range from one single-family house that worked to all the way up to a 13-unit apartment building. The vast majority of them are 2, 3, and 4-unit sort of small apartment buildings. And, knowing that we had purchased the worst properties, we knew that we were going to make significant investments in the rehabs of these. And, so these properties are ranging, some of them are as old, I think, built as early as 1899 or early 1900s. And so as we began to do the rehab, we're replacing all the systems, roofing, plumbing, electrical, bringing them up to current code standards, making all the properties, and this is a consistent standard amongst all our NSP properties, bring them to an enterprise green community standard, so they're very highly energy efficient. The building envelopes are sealed. We've got insulation in both the walls, the ceilings, the floors. All the fixtures are Energy Star rated. And you'll see, like on this next slide here, the photo of one particular property. You'll see we're putting in drought-tolerant landscaping. So we're making a great deal of investment in the rehab, and we're not doing any less rehab on these properties as we're doing to any other properties. We worked with Mark and the county to determine, specifically what, the rehab needs would be for, the population of folks that are going to be served at these households. And so our investment in this is significant. It is just over $12 million for these properties in the rehab. And so the properties, range in price from about the cheapest one was $136,000, in dilapidated condition, all the way up to, I think the most expensive one was just over $800,000. And our rehabs are ranging from $150,000 for the smaller properties, up to just over $1 million for some of the larger multifamily one. And so when these are done, all the systems will be new. They'll be highly energy efficient, and several of them we're doing ADA improvements too. As we walk through them again with Mark and the county, we determined which ones could benefit from the ADA improvements, and so those will be available to some of the households as well. So that's, I guess, kind of the project, the NSP element of these individual properties, and I'm going to turn it back over to Mark to talk about. He's going to go over a little bit of the cost, not only ours, but some of the anticipated operating cost, and then how the cost savings that will be realized by the clients being able to move into these properties. Mark?
Yeah, thanks. Before I launch into the cost, we don't have enough time, and we don't have all the slides of the various properties that we're using. But one value, I think, and demonstration value of this project is they're really varied sites, and I'm finding them very interesting. They're sort of not exactly like anything that we've worked on in the past, and as you heard, they vary from a 13-unit apartment building to a single-family house, and I think it nicely drives home, and certainly some of our experience, that you can do supportive housing in many different housing typologies, and this doesn't even fall squarely into the three, standard types that were up on the screen earlier in the afternoon. It's sort of scattered site, but not, because we're in this, very local, tight geographic location. Some of the buildings have 13 apartments, some have 6, some have 4, and we're going to have a roving case management model. We're going to have one property management entity for all of the sites and one support service entity. So it's kind of single site, quasi scattered site model. And just to quickly look at the slide on the screen and the cost, recapping where the money's coming from or how much it's costing. We talked about the housing department's contribution, and the renovation, as you saw on that other slide, and some of the other projects I've seen are just absolutely amazing, and certainly I think fit our feeling and sense that homeless people should have really good, clean, high-quality housing to move in, and we've certainly experienced how therapeutic that is for people to move into housing, and how it makes one value your own life and work to hold on to that housing. This will probably be the nicest housing that many of the folks that we are able to put into this housing have seen in a long time. So the other financial contributors, really importantly, is the Housing Authority with a 10-year value of about $6 million. So therefore, the operating subsidies, the operating costs of this project will be largely covered through Section 8 vouchers. We do expect some households that we will house to not be able to qualify for Section 8, and we're sort of accounting for that in the pro forma. And then the Department of Health Services making a significant contribution to the support services of the site. And while sometimes it's hard to leverage these or obtain these support service dollars, it really is based on the notion that this is going to be saving the county health system in the long run funding. And so that moves us to this next slide here. And these are just, and I'm sure many people have seen different, slides like this and different characterizations of the cost savings. These are a couple different ways. We sliced it looking at some of the figures in LA that the Department of Health Services provides inpatient services to approximately 2,300 patients annually at a cost of about $70 million. So if we can reduce that by any measure, there's a lot of cost savings to be had there. You can see our average inpatient cost. Homeless people tend to have very high inpatient costs. They're often held longer than other folks because there's nowhere to discharge them to. And it's very difficult to send someone out with a chronic health issue who just had some sort of acute episode to the street. No one wants to do that, and no one should have to endure that. So their stays in hospital tend to be much longer at a much higher cost. The next bullet is sort of another way of slicing that, the uncompensated days at a certain point when someone's in the hospital and they're no longer acute. Hospitals are not getting reimbursed for that cost. And the last bullet there is just a look at a housing, supportive housing project that the Department of Health Services has been working on that demonstrated quite a savings with just the units that they've already put online. So we're looking to replicate that on a much larger scale. This effort with the NSP projects is the next opportunity to do that. And I think at this point, are we going back to discussion topics?
Yeah, I think we'll turn it back over to Kent.
Yep, let's do that. Thank you for those. Let's see first what questions we have for these couple of examples here. And I'm going to go back. Here's a question here for you, Roberta. I'm going to go back to slide 45. And Don asks, did that $99,000 include services and rental subsidies?
Let me look at it here to make sure I provide some needed clarification. If you on the second to the last column, the rental and services, our funding is flexible enough that the owners and operators of a permanent supported housing can make use of those dollars for either for rental subsidies or to pay for services or to pay for the case manager if they have assigned case managers. The model and the flexibility that we built into it is that if the operator of the permanent supported housing is not also a service provider, that they can enter into an MOU with the local service provider, be it the local county health department or be it another specialized nonprofit agency, that they can use these dollars to finance and provide for the services. In the case of the Housing Authority of Jackson County, the more than $500,000 that we allocated to them is mostly for supportive services. The Housing Authority is providing the housing vouchers for it. So it's probably a little bit misleading on our part to say the 99, but really it's that the construction, really the true cost that we're looking at. But yeah, you could add that the additional $24,000 that you could add to what I said before in the construction was 75.5, so you would add another 24,000. That would bring it to that total. But I think it's probably best to try to break it out in looking at the cost of developing and do a separate breakout of the cost for the operating and services. Our resources are limited, unlike in the case of the County of LA. We don't have the means to provide for 10 years. I mean, that's been our plan, but it's at our state level, we don't have access to a lot of resources. So ours are limited to 4 years of a contract for services for the operators. But what that means or what that does, though, we ask them to seek for other long-term subsidies or other types of long-term resources for operations, and our partners have stepped up to the plate, and many of them have gotten the additional resources. And what we've built into our contract for services is that if they don't use our funds within the contract term, they can extend it. And so they could presumably, if they bring other resources into it, they could extend this funding to 10 years or longer if they have additional resources. But in our minds, we believe that by giving them this type of funding for operations and subsidies, it gives them at least 4 or 5 years to come up or to build a different plan or put the tenants on a different and longer term type of support and services.
Very good, thank you. And I don't see any other questions at the moment for LA or Oregon, but they may be coming as we continue here. So let me turn it over back now to Marc Toussaint, and there you go, Marc.
Okay. Thank you so much, Ken. And really, I know we don't have a lot of time. This is sort of a virtual discussion, but we just wanted to sort of put you in the position to just understand some of the questions. These really transcend the entire presentation, just things to consider on this theme of using NSP for permanent supportive housing. So, what's the appropriate role for these properties? How connected are supportive housing advocates and sort of stakeholders in the process of entertaining decisions around how to use the program for this purpose? Some of the unique challenges that go with the NSP stock. I think all the presenters have tried to underscore this issue of, there are some unique issues around scattered site service provision, property management provision, and just looking beyond NSP, how can we address the financing needs to be able to sustain this housing? moving forward. So those are things to consider. Not obviously, we really can't engage in an active discussion about that, but those are things that are relatively universal. And I know this is typical of all the NSP webinars, but just to really reiterate, the resource exchange is a tremendous, tremendous resource for all things related to the program. So you have the opportunity to look at a library, to entertain, questions that have been asked over time, to request technical assistance, to sort of see HUD guidance and policy alerts and things like that. And if you're not on the listserv already, I'd really encourage you to join the listserv there. So this is something, again, just to reiterate the importance of the resource exchange and sort of cataloging all of the information about the program. And then finally, more unique to this specific topic, what we've tried to do is catalog some resources for you that'll be available to sort of amplify the points we've made today. So the first link is this NSP supportive housing guide that I think I referenced in my presentation. And then CSH has been kind enough to produce some profiles that really go through some of the more specifics around examples where, on specific properties that have been, created as permanent supportive housing through NSP, and these really span the country. But, information on the partners that are involved, the financing that goes into that, some of the key features that go into that program. Really, really good stuff. So that's all accessible as well. And then finally, there's sort of a broader resource guide that's created by CSH around creating and operating supportive housing. If you're not familiar with those resources, definitely check those out. I think you'll find those very useful to sort of underscore some of the points that have been made today.
And this slide is just a reminder that when we do close the webinar, you'll be taken automatically to a quick survey form, and we'd love your thoughts on how this went, what you'd like to see more of in the future. And so please take a few moments to answer those questions when that time comes, but that's not yet. Let's now take questions, and there's some people have been waiting patiently for a while here. Paul asks, what accessibility requirements are there for NSP projects?
Yes, John. There are the same accessibility requirements as for the CDBG program. Basically, Section 504 requirements apply. We don't have time to go into all the details, but there are supporting materials out there to explain that.
And moving on to Michael, who asks, HUD was very specific that each NSP recipient used the widget tool when determining target areas. Since the market is continuously changing and there's less and less inventory, will there be some flexibility in amending target areas to address homelessness?
There's flexibility to address changing conditions, including homelessness. So yes, you can amend your action plan using the same tool. We are actually looking now at trying to update the underlying demographic data for that, just to get a more current picture. But it's not unusual for situations to have changed, even as in the time that the applications got put together and the center of activity moved or whatever. So most of those in NSP3 are going to be local amendments that you work through with your field office, and you notify your citizens, and then if there aren't problems there, chances are you're going to be going back to your elected officials, however you work that. But for the most part, they're within local control.
Michael asks, can we expect any additional NSP, possibly NSP4 dollars, to help address homelessness? I guess that's the $64,000 question.
Yeah, the $15 billion question. Well, there is a proposal called Project Rebuild. It doesn't seem to be getting funded this year. I guess, it's anybody's guess what happens next year. But what I've been suggesting is that program income is NSP4. And so if you're in a community that has a program that generates income, typically if you have a acquisition, rehab, resale type of a program, you will be getting revenues. And it's not unusual for communities to have 50+% of their original grant already back. Just in the NSP1 program, there's about $550 million so far in program income. So I think that's the way to look at it. I mean, that's a stream of income that you can count on because it's controlled locally, and I would say that's your sort of bridge to the future, whatever the future may be.
And Mike down in Nevada says, if using NSP to promote the development of permanent supportive housing is such a high priority, why not make the job easier by waiving the NSP restrictive requirements such as target neighborhood, purchase discount, foreclosure, etc.?
Well, it is a high priority for us, but most of those requirements that you cite and that we have in the program come directly from the legislation, and you can't waive legislation. So what we're trying to do is work within that. But I was just saying to Ann here that, I mean, there's better and worse fits for this program too. So, take a look at it, and if it makes sense, it might be a good way to leverage some of these programs together. But depending on what you need the money for, you can't really use the NSP money for operating funds or for services. So if your needs are capital needs, that's great. But if they aren't, then maybe it's not a good fit. But unfortunately, we can't waive all those. God knows we've tried. But so that's just the way it is.
Marie's got a question that was tied to the question about NSP4, but I'll ask anyway. It was stated earlier that one of the NSP rounds was open to nonprofit organization applications in the past, and that was NSP2. Will there be another opportunity soon for the application of NSP funds, and if not soon, another NOFA announcement?
Well, not until we get additional funds, and as I say, that's really difficult to predict. But again, I think you have the ability to access funds locally by being a nonprofit and talking to your local unit of government, which may have received NSP funds directly, and you may say, well, that was a year ago, and they're probably already committed, but as one of the earlier questions suggested, not everything that was planned is actually happening, and so things change, funds free up, program income comes back to the program, so I would really open that conversation with your city or county or state to see what might be there now that could be useful to you.
Matt wonders, can an NSP2 housing provider lease units to a Continuum of Care member who utilizes SHP leasing dollars for permanent supportive housing?
I think so. Well, from our standpoint, probably so.
Yeah, I think that, again, they would have to go, depending on the specific circumstances of, I think, who owns the property. Certainly, if they don't own the property themselves, they can lease from the property owner with SHP dollars, which is, I think, the question. However, we do have some restrictions about if you own the property, whether you can use SHP leasing dollars for a property you already own, and that question would have to go to their CPD rep in their field office. But if they don't own the property, then the answer is yes.
Very good. Michael asks, says CDBG and home have a prohibition against mixing them with public housing capital funds. Does NSP have the same prohibition?
Yeah, we were kicking that around. I think in CDBG's case, it may be because they don't do new construction, and NSP does allow new construction. The only time that I've really seen public housing funds get involved with NSP is through Section 8 vouchers. I'm not sure. I mean, I can't say that I've seen a lot of that, so maybe there's a reason that I don't know about. But I think you have different kind of ownership structures with public housing authorities, and it's a little more difficult to make that work with the type of ownership that we have in NSP. Typically, you're going to have somebody buying a house and occupying it or operating it as a rental. So yeah, I'm not sure if there's more to that. You could write back or and we could give you more information. But I don't know 100% why that is, or whether there isn't a strict prohibition, but it's not happening either. So.
Ebony asks, is an amendment required to entertain doing a permanent supportive housing project that is currently not in our NSP1 or NSP3 target area?
Yes, Ebony, you do have to do an amendment, but it's a local amendment, so it shouldn't be that difficult. And your folks are right downtown there, so it shouldn't be difficult if you've got a particular property that you're going after, and the amendment is a fairly strategic one in terms of the size of it. It shouldn't be a problem.
So that doesn't go back to HUD headquarters?
Not for NSP 1 or 3, no, and her county doesn't have NSP 2. So.
Very good. You'll note that there are a number of more NSP webinars scheduled for this month, and hope to see you at some of those. I'm going to scroll through the questions some more and see if we have any. Let's see. Christina says, my agency is also the NSP grantee. I work as the Continuum of Care coordinator. It's my understanding that my agency cannot benefit from any of the homes. Therefore, it would be impossible for us to utilize NSP to create units of permanent supportive housing and use our S&C and PSH vouchers.
So this is Ann from the SNAP's office. We'd have to look at the specific ownership structures of that particular housing, but I think that the way to do that with a Shelter Plus Care voucher is to have it be a sponsor-based program. But again, I'd like to take a look at the specific circumstances around that particular project. And if you want to submit that question to the Homelessness Resource Exchange help desk, we'll be sure to flag it as something that came in through this webinar, and we'll get to it quickly.
Very good. I'm not sure who this is addressed to, but Michael asks, as one of the partners, you did not mention community redevelopment agencies. Are they a viable resource?
Well, yeah, we have in NSP, we have some community redevelopment agencies, and they are, I would say, certainly players in the sense that a housing authority or any redevelopment authority or a nonprofit that does that kind of work would be. They are considered to be public nonprofit agencies in our situation, so they have to operate as grantees or sub-recipients, but that shouldn't be a problem. But again, I think this would be on the capital side of the transaction rather than on the operating or service side of it.
So surprisingly, it looks like we've come to the end of the questions. I wonder if anybody has any closing thoughts or comments you'd like to add.
Oh. No?
Right. Well, yeah, I would say, again, if it makes sense, this is a good fit. We're not saying that you should run out and try to jam two programs together that in your circumstances don't fit well. So, this is a priority in the sense that we like to be able to work together and to support each other's work, and we recognize that maybe being able to provide an affordable unit that permanent supportive housing services could operate would makes a lot of sense. But you've got to be set up for it. You've got to have your partners lined up, and so don't just do it because we said it. Do it because it's a good idea.
Indeed. Well, if there's nothing else, we sure do appreciate all of the hard work that everybody on this slide put into making today possible. It was a big coordination effort, and thank you for that. Thank you for your time today, and to all you participants for joining us. We wouldn't be doing this if you weren't here, so thanks for your participation and your questions, and we look forward to seeing you all soon on another NSP webinar. Take care, everyone.